I'm Sarah Cott, Senior Vice President of Programming at The Hill. We are thrilled to be here today at the studios of WHUT Howard University. Today, a record number of Black women are serving in Congress and state legislatures, but they are still significantly underrepresented. What needs to be done to increase Black female representation in politics at all levels, and what can be the impact going forward? And with that, I am delighted to welcome the host of today's event, Cheyanne Daniels, the Hill's race and politics reporter. She is joined by Gabriel Wyatt, founder of the Highland Project, Bowie City Councilwoman Roxanne Inde-Bumadu, Adrian Shropshire, Executive Director of Black PAC, and Kimberly Klasick, who will be joining us shortly. Cheyanne?
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We are here to talk about Black women in politics, and so I love seeing all of the beautiful Black women in the audience today. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to hop right in and start with just a question for everybody here. In your opinion, when we think about Black female representation, are we represented in our politics today? Gabrielle, would you like to start?
Thank you for having me. I'm Gabrielle Wyatt. I'm the founder of the Highland Project. And when I think about this question, I actually first think about the women that the Highland Project invests in, the coalition across generations and sectors that we've been investing in since 2020. And when I first look at that question, I say yes, because I think about leaders like Mary Pat Hector, who ran as soon as she could for Atlanta City Council, and now she leads RISE, which is one of the largest national nonprofits focused on students alleviating the unfair student debt that they are carrying. She invested her Highland Project dollars in Equity for All to ensure that Gen Z organizers knew that they not just had the power to organize, but they also had the power and the right to run for office. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can sit and look at the national numbers and actually look at national policies, right, and feel the rollback that's actually happening right now. But when I look at the leadership of the Highland Project, I see us represented. I see us exercising our power and our agency.
Adrian, do you feel that Black women are represented in our politics today?
So it's, you know, when you said the question, the first thing I thought is, how do we define politics, maybe, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that, because I know I'm a Black woman, and I'm not sure I see myself as being in politics, right? I think that there's a way in which Black women participate, make significant and huge contributions to our communities, who see themselves as leaders, whether they are, working in the schools, or they're leading a community group, or they're, engaged in policy. And I'm not sure that people tie that all together and say this is politics, when in fact it really is. And so, I think generally when I think about the women that we are, working with and encouraging to mobilize their communities for elections, there's a lot of women, right? There's a lot of Black women. And so I think on that level, yes, right, we will ourselves to engage, right, based on how we see and what we understand to be the needs of our community. When I look at the United States Senate, that's a different story, right? Are we representing the United States Senate? No, we're not, right? And so there's a, when we think about the record numbers of women who have run for office, who are in, Congress right now, record numbers of Black women, that's a significant accomplishment, but there's so much further to go. And we know that having, we would hope that we would have 2 Black women in the Senate, come in when we get to 2020 through 2024, but we may not, and we may be not represented there. Again, we certainly have Senator Butler right now, but that's temporary. So, so when we look across offices, there's a lot of work to be done.
Roxy, I'm very curious about, as somebody who has run and been elected, what your thoughts are on whether or not Black women are represented in our politics.
Well, first of all, Cheyanne, let me start by saying thank you so much for extending an invitation to me. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roxy Inde-Bumadu, and I have the distinct pleasure of being elected to the Bowie City Council in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is the best county, I would have to say, in all of America. But I would say my proudest hat is being a Howard University graduate of the School of College of Nursing and Allied Sciences. Yep. Let's give it up for HU. So, when you started the question, there were so many things going through my head. I would have to say my answer is no. And let me tell you why my answer is no. When I think about politics, as somebody who's been a 2-term elected official, I ran the second time in 2023, one of the youngest women in the state of Maryland, so many things. Politics to me is designed to have power. But when I look at Black women who are in positions of power, and I mean decision-making power, I don't see very many. So that's why I would say my answer is no. Because we have a lot of Black women who are defining politics, who are creating movements within politics, who are adjacent to politics, but do we have a lot of Black women who actually have decision-making power within politics? The answer is no. So I would have to say, by my definition, as somebody who is sitting at that table, who is creating legislation, who has the responsibility of looking after a community of 70,000 people, one of the fastest growing in the state of Maryland, I would definitely define that as no. Not yet.
Yeah, and I want to stick with you for one moment, Roxy, as being somebody who is elected, as representing the Republican Party right now, looking out at this beautiful young crowd right here, with that in mind that we are not represented at the decision-making table, can you just talk a little bit about how you got to that table to be able to sit there and say, I'm gonna be part of these decisions?
Wow, I can't say that I woke up and that was my thought one day, and it's crazy. So let me take a step back. This morning when I was getting dressed, I put on my class ring and I almost like wanted to go into tears, because it wasn't so long ago that I was sitting right here in the same very seat back in 2016 before I walked across the stage. And when I drove around campus looking for parking, we'll be talking to Muriel Bowser sometime this week about this, I said to myself, wow, it feels like yesterday. I was just right here. I didn't wake up walking the streets of Howard University saying I'm gonna run for office, saying I'm gonna have a seat at the table. That wasn't my story. I knew that I was going to get a job, I was gonna provide for my family, I was gonna do all these great things, maybe have the opportunity to go to Europe and go on vacation, finally learn what vacation actually meant. And then I got to Microsoft after college. And Microsoft was amazing. I was in big tech, but even being in big tech, less than 3% were Black women in big tech. And I looked around and I said, wow, we have so much power. We're designing all these products that people are using, but there's less than 3% Black women in the room making the products. That's a problem for me. So one day I was sitting in a room, and I will always, always give this man the highest honor because he changed the trajectory of my career, Fred Humphreys. He said, you should maybe run for office. And I was like, Fred, have you met me? Like, what is going on here? No, I should not. He said, Roxy, you should run for office. And I said, I respected Fred, very prominent government affairs professional, knows a lot of people, seen a lot. So I said, maybe I should. So I looked into running for elected office. It was about 45 days before the city council election. I said, you know what, why not? If I don't tell my story, who's gonna tell it? If I don't represent my people, who's gonna represent my people? And I ran for office. I wasn't very active in politics. I wasn't very active in a party. I just knew that I grew up in a community. I was passionate about that community. I saw what happened to my community when certain people got into power, felt like the community was going in a different direction. And I said, if not me, then who? And so I ran, and then I won. And I became the first African-American woman to represent my district. And let me tell you the power in that and why this is so important. First of all, I won by 16 votes. So every vote matters. 16 votes. So if 16 people woke up that morning and said, you know what, I'm not gonna go vote today because my vote doesn't matter, I wouldn't be sitting on the stage. I wouldn't be in the room at all. And by right, you wouldn't be in the room because I'm not in the room. So let's start there. Then let's take that a step further. After winning by 16 votes, after becoming one of the youngest, then I started to engage with the party a little bit more. And I was like, that's a little interesting. But what I learned was, I can't expect you to legislate an experience that you don't understand and you don't have. This is my lived experience. This is my community's lived experience. You can sympathize. Maybe you might be able to empathize one day. But what you won't be able to do is adequately represent me and my community because you don't have that experience. And so I became that voice in the party, and they embraced me because I was unapologetic about representing my community and my lived experience. But by representing my lived experience and my community's lived experience, that didn't negate theirs. It didn't mean that theirs was any less important than the lived experience of my community. But I knew that my community's experience had to be in the room in order for decisions to be made and policies to be changed.
Roxy, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to pivot just a touch to you, Gabrielle. When we think about the Highland Project's mission of helping invest, sustain women in leadership roles, listening to Roxy's story, how do you see us collectively ensuring that not just she in her position, but other women are able to seek out that position and say, without somebody else coming up to them and saying, oh yeah, you should run? How do we just instill that in women naturally?
I think a couple of things. I think one, the power already is in us as Black women and girls. I grew up in a household on the better side of the Beltway in Baltimore, and it was a household of educators, youngest of 3. And I knew growing up because of my parents that I was brilliant and that I was powerful. And it's also true that the headwinds of over 400 years of structural racism continue to blow strong. They continue to try to blow us down. And I have a similar story of an educator seeing in me that I should run for school board at age 17, and that's what I did, and I earned my seat. But fast forward to the Highland Project, and I think for us, what we care deeply about is creating a circle that is truly intergenerational to pass on this power that lives within us. So often when I was in leadership roles in public service, there were never intergenerational tables. At best, they might have been 2 generations, but we never were sitting with someone 2 generations behind us and 2 generations ahead of us. And I think when we're not sitting together, we lose our stories. We lose the stories of Roxy's power. We lose what it's like to sit as a Black woman as the only and have to carry on despite the forces trying to push us out of the seat. We're talking a lot about getting into the seat, but what does it mean if we don't get there? 1. 2, what does it mean when we're there? How do we sustain ourselves through it? And 3, what does it mean on the other side? What's our responsibility for continuing to cultivate a bench of leadership around us?
Adrienne, you and I have talked extensively about particularly Black voters. So I want to pivot just a little bit because Roxy said something about when she saw certain leadership in her community, she felt there was changes happening in her community. What are some of the things that Black PAC are hearing as what Black women especially want to see, not just going into 2024, but sort of from all of our elected leaders right now?
So I think that we all can relate to what we've been hearing from folks, and we've been doing a lot of focus groups around the country over the last 6 months or so. And I think that the one thing that stands out, because we hear it all the time, we see it in our own neighborhoods, we see it in our own families, is that there's just a lot of anxiety right now. People are very worried, they're very concerned, and there's a list of reasons that I'll touch on a couple. That are, about the issues that people care about, that you then add a national election on top of that, and people, and you add, sort of we all sort of have pushed the COVID era aside, but the reality is that people are still struggling coming out of that period. And so there's a lot of anxiety right now. Folks also, I think we oftentimes hear a lot about apathy in our community and that, people don't want to get involved and that they don't want to vote. We don't actually experience that as a reality. And whether that is when we're knocking on doors and talking to people or when we have people in focus groups, people really do want to be involved. They really do care. They really do want to make sure that they are, making a positive contribution however they can. There's a lot of things about politics that people just don't understand, right? And we talk about civics all the time, and we need to increase our knowledge of civics and how our government works and how our elections work. And that's all true. And the challenge is that when people don't have that information, they feel disempowered, right? And so I often, say to folks that we need to really, not use the word apathetic so much, because really we need to be finding grace for people who step out or remove themselves from our politics or from our electoral process because they don't have the information, right? And it's our responsibility, right, to get people the information because people feel not just disempowered. There's a lot of shame, frankly, right? When we're in focus groups and people don't know the answers, their first reaction is, well, it doesn't matter, right? Or, oh, I'm not gonna vote because it doesn't matter. And then when you dig underneath that, what it really is people are embarrassed that they don't understand, that they don't know all the things, right? And there's a sense that they're gonna be judged for it, right? And so we need to offer Black women grace and not make assumptions about what people do and don't know. But there's a lot of anxiety right now, and we always think that, oftentimes, I wouldn't say we always, but we oftentimes think that when people say that they're not happy about the direction of the country, we assume that that's mostly about the economy, right? We assume that it's because people, are feeling the pressure of the economic conditions, and that's true, right? There is a lot of anxiety around the economy right now, but there's a whole host of issues that Black women are concerned about right now. K through 12 education, right? Black maternal health and other women's health issues, right? Concerned about the cost of healthcare, concerned about the college affordability, right? Concerned about racism and white supremacy. So there's a whole gun violence, a whole host of issues that Black women care about. All of those things right now, in some way, are really significant or under assault, right? The right to vote is always a top issue. And so when you look at all of these issues that are top of mind for Black women right now, and we look at the ways that all of those issues are under duress, and we can see and we get the picture of why people say things are not going great. And it's not just because of the economy. That's part of it, but there are a whole host of other issues. And so I think that, part of our role at Black PAC and many organizations like ours really is to make sure that we are providing information for people, that we're actually we're talking this stuff through with people, right? Like we're helping people to understand not just the importance of elections, but the importance of their participation, right? And the power that they do have, right? And we talk a lot about power because people feel powerless, right? When they have the sense of anxiety, they have a sense of powerlessness. And so we talk with people about what our power can do. We talk about history, right? We talk about our struggle to sort of have full citizenship in this country. And we talk about, the path, right, that our ancestors took, right, to get us to the place where we are now. And what does that mean in terms of responsibility? So we try and do education with people that really is about bringing people to the point where they feel like they can exercise their own power and they understand the importance and significance of it, so that people feel like they have control, right? That they have some control over their own lives. They have control over politics, even when they say, "Oh no, I don't do politics," right? Politics, I don't do that. We talk about what does that really mean, right? So there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of stress, but there's also a lot of hope, I would say. And people really do. Again, there is a sense that I know I have to do something. I know I have to participate. And the one thing that I can do collectively with my community, because voting in a way is a community action, right? For our community is a way in which in some moments that we show actual resistance, right? Is by showing up and voting, and people are feeling that in a really intense way right now.
Kimberly, hi, how are you?
Good morning, I'm doing good, how are you?
Good morning, I'm so happy that you're here with us today. We are talking about the power of Black women at this moment, and I love it. And you, as Roxy, are currently running. And a reminder, this is not a campaign stump at all, promise y'all. But with that, you are bringing a very unique experience to us today. And so I want to take a moment to acknowledge what some of the barriers you think are facing Black women from seeking out office right now.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a good question. I think women in general, I mean, the political arena is really a male-dominant world. And so for women in general, I think it's very difficult. I think sometimes, as a Black woman, sometimes you're kind of looked at as you're not taken so seriously. I definitely feel that in many rooms. But you know, you can always prove yourself and show what your worth is. Before running for office, I ran a nonprofit. We did workforce development, helped women become financially independent. And I think when you just share exactly what your experience is and what qualifies you for the position, people really then begin to take you seriously. And so that's what we try to do all the time.
Yeah, and we spoke with Roxy a little bit earlier about sort of what inspired her to run, and I'm hoping you can share with our audience today what inspired you to say, I want to be in the room making the decisions.
Well, I don't know if everybody knows, but I'm from the Baltimore area, and so we have a lot going on politically. Unfortunately, even when I was running my nonprofit, we would come up against a lot of barriers for the women, and most of it came from the career development centers that were connected with the mayor's office or city hall in general. And so what I noticed was we could do more to help, but they weren't really making and pulling those punches, right? It was just, we were always coming up to a roadblock or some kind of obstacle. So I said, you know what, I think if we were on the other side and really try to get these women to be independent, get them what they need, their resources, I think we could move forward. I felt as though, unfortunately, in some of these cases, when you have maybe the Career Center or the nonprofits doing this work, I think sometimes they feel as though if the work's not there, they might not have a job. So it's kind of like job security to continue it and maybe slow down the process. When I thought, you know what, these women can't wait another day. These women have things to do, bills to pay, and families and mouths to feed. So I just thought, you know what, let's get in there and really, you know, push and strive to make this work.
Yeah. You know, you are all incredibly powerful Black women in this moment, but we have a room right now of so many Black women, and I know there are others here who might not identify as a woman, but I want to take a moment to turn it over to our audience to ask these four, I can count, this is why I'm not a math person, our four beautiful panelists if they have any questions. And I believe there is a microphone up here if somebody would like to, right over here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I didn't know how loud this was going to be. I am Amber Dodd. I am the associate editor of the university. I also am the associate editor of Howard Magazine as well. My question today is, because we are producing an election story within our upcoming magazine for spring summer, do you think that the mistrust of Black voters or young Black voters is well earned, especially in the day and age where the seniors of Howard are the people who missed out on their freshman year? You know, 2020 was COVID time, and we've seen the tumultuous political environment. So I'm wondering, do you feel that young voters have earned their mistrust with the political atmosphere that we're seeing today? Thank you.
I can start. So there's a lot of mistrust in general across the board, regardless of, you know, age demographic. You know, I think that, so I would say the younger generation, and I think that when I was talking about the issues and the sort of anxiety that is felt when we're talking with voters, I would say that there is, the intensity of that is felt most by younger people, right? And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of issues. The sort of list of issues that I talked about are those are, you know, what we would say in our, you know, when we're doing research, those are top box issues for young people, and they don't see, and you all don't see oftentimes progress being made on those issues, or you're seeing rights being rolled back right before our very eyes. And so there's a reason to say, well, what is this all about, right? Why am I showing up, right? We expect a transaction in some ways in our politics. We show up, we vote, we tell you ahead of time what we want you to do, right? The issues we want you to work on, the policies we want you to fix. We give you, you say, I'll do those things, we give you our vote, and then there isn't progress or things get rolled back. There's also a lot of, sort of when we think about, the sort of top issues, whether it's gun violence or abortion rights, you have, obviously this expectation that that policies and laws will pass that make things better, whether it's on, sort of the gun violence front or it's on women's reproductive health. And so I think that that yes, it's warranted because we have, again, we want to see progress. I think we have to understand that things take time, right? And I'm now that old lady who says that, right? Like, things take time and we have to wait. But some of that, though, I think is also about the thing I said earlier about making sure that we all understand actually how things get done, right? Where the interventions can happen, right? To speed things up, right? Or to disrupt them, right? And so I think that that's also part of, both the expectation that we all should have of ourselves when we decide that this is going to be our work. That we have to help educate people on what the process is, where the intervention points are, and how we organize the power that's necessary to be able to intervene, right? And I think that that is an important part of helping to heal, right, the distrust and the mistrust that many people in our community have of our political process.
Can I just add real fast that at Highland, we've developed one of the largest national polls of Black women registered to vote with our partner, Cornell Belcher. And over the last 3 years, we've seen the consistent rise in dissatisfaction among Gen Z and millennial voters. And so I just want to reiterate what Adrienne said, like, we're not here to judge is it earned or not. Like, you're naming this as your lived experience. Where I frankly get nervous as a Black woman for our community as a whole is that when we looked at the data this past summer, it was over 1 in 5 Black women across all generations that we polled said that they were undecided or not supportive of the political candidate who was likely to run for president. My hope is that that does not turn into not showing up at the voting booth. It has to show up at the voting booth, but I think what you're hearing from Adrienne as well is we have to do more. It's whether you see yourself in running for political office, whether you see yourself being a chief of staff to the future Roxy, whether you see yourself in philanthropy, moving the important dollars that are necessary to sustain movements. It's not enough to vote. It's an important first step, but I think we have to see the sustained action through. And my question to you all, it's to myself every day, is what are we fighting for? What are we fighting for, and what's the 1 or 2 actions that we're going to take, not just between now and November, but on the other side of November to pursue that future?
And I want to turn it over very quickly to Roxy and Kimberly and extrapolate a little bit on that question and say, with that mistrust, which we know is there, how does that affect the way that you're talking to these young voters in your communities to tell them, maybe not, you don't have to trust me, but to know, like, we hear you, we hear that distrust, and we know perhaps it is rightfully earned.
Okay. I will say that I think there might be a lot of mistrust because of the media. I'm one of those people. Look, I ran in 2020. I believe we had a successful run as far as getting our name out there and name ID. We had the most watched campaign ad in history. But even in Black spaces, nobody really acknowledged that. And I think sometimes when you're Black and a Republican, sometimes you are looked down upon or at differently by other Black people, which I don't think is helpful, honestly. And so for me, I would think that if we could come together and just know, look, if you really want somebody at the table, you need to have people on both sides, right? Because when you have the Republicans that have the majority in the House and say we have the majority in the Senate and say that Trump's in office, you still want Black people at the table, right? So you can't just push people away because they're on the other side of the aisle. I think sometimes that mistrust is there. And I would say that, with your own very eyes, you're not stupid. You see what's going on. But then you hear a different story from the media and you're kind of looking at it like, wow, I'm watching this real, live in time on Instagram and they're telling me a different story, but you know the truth. It's like, what are you going to believe, your lying eyes? And so I think we have to really just remember that not everybody has the same ideas and policies, but we all want to get there into the same place, right? We all want public safety. We all want a good education system. We don't want to pay, $8 for a carton of eggs, right? We all want the same things, but there's different ways to go about it. And I think sometimes when you shun some people because they're on some different side of the aisle or different viewpoint, I think sometimes that hurts us as a whole as far as the community.
I think there's two things that I have to start off with saying. One thing that I need people to realize that Kim touched on. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I just need you to understand that. That's just it, and that's all. The second thing is, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time, not the second, third, or fourth, or fifth, or sixth, the first time. And I feel like there have been a lot of elected leaders who have shown the community who they are, but yet for some reason, we don't want to believe them, for whatever reason. And so I think it's both sides. And I can say this confidently because I'm a millennial. I'm 30 years old. I just turned 30 last year. And so I think for me, what was so interesting about my race and talking to voters and getting people to vote for you, because understand that one of the most intimate things you can ever do is cast a vote. It is a very intimate experience. And to convince people that you are the leader of their lifetime is a very powerful thing. For me, as a Republican woman, Black woman, who represents an 89% Democrat area, 89%, I need you guys to understand, it's very historic and it's very unusual. In our campaign was all ran by all Black women, my campaign specifically. Only one of them was Republican, because I don't believe in siloed success. I don't believe in, oh, I'm only Republican, so I can't talk to Democrats, this and that. Because at the end of the day, like Kim said, we all want to get to the same destination. But people also have to understand that with the democratization of information, it has made it very difficult to suss out what's real and what's not real, especially with the rise of artificial intelligence, deep fakes, things of that sort. So now we're talking about having the agency to be able to delineate between what's real and what's not real, and really doing that due diligence and having that opportunity to understand, how is this person going to show up for me? Because the concept of servant leadership is something that's real, but it's no longer real in our politics, unfortunately. And so to answer your question, is the mistrust earned? I think it's on both sides. It's not just on the millennials and the Gen Zs. It's not just on the elected leaders. It's on both sides, because many elected leaders have showed you who they are. Nobody wants to believe them for whatever reason. And so there's a thing of insanity and expecting different results not coming. But then there's also this thing of, you owe it to yourself and you deserve to have that representation in every room, at every table, on every side. Because like I said in the beginning, if you're not at the table, you are on the menu. And I see that so distinctly clear by being the only Republican on a body of 7 elected individuals, and really being in those rooms and having a gentleman who's not saying, why am I going to raise taxes in an election year? I'm going to just wait and run for re-election and raise taxes after the election. I hear those conversations. I hear them so clearly. But again, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And fortunately for my community, I'm at the table.
Thank y'all so much.
Yes, and I just want to echo that sentiment. Thank you, Gabrielle, Adrian, Roxy, Kimberly. You have all been absolutely incredible. We're so appreciative of you for taking this time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joining me now is the Ronald W. Walters Endowed Chair of Race and Black Politics at Howard University. She was also the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States. I'd like to welcome Stacey Abrams. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I am well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we are here to talk about Black women in politics. And as we get started, I want to ask you the same question that I started our panel with, which is, do you feel that we are accurately represented in our political world right now?
Not at all.
No.
No. Part of representation is power. It is not only having the numbers, but it's having the ability to translate those numbers into lived experience, into policymaking. And we live in a time where Black maternal mortality is at an extraordinary level. We live in a moment where our tax policies do not reflect the realities of our labor cycle. We live in a moment where the denial of access to health care is incredibly persistent in the region of the country where 56% of African Americans live, which means Black women are being denied access to health care. And we live in a moment where this is the first generation to actually lose constitutional rights since Reconstruction. And for women of color, for Black women in particular, the loss of bodily autonomy is dangerous to our economic future, our educational future, and it is an assault on our civil rights. And so, no, I do not believe that we are adequately represented.
You know, one of the things that we often hear when we think about representation is we think about the federal level. We think about our White House, we think about our Senate and the House of Representatives, but how important is representation at our state and local levels?
I began my political work at the local level. I was actually deputy city attorney for the city of Atlanta, and it was that experience that actually led me to run for state legislature, in part because I saw a mayor who attempted to solve hyperlocal issues, often being thwarted by a state government that did not respect her responsibilities. We know that there is an intentional devolution of power from the federal to the state level. Again, it has been most acute when it comes to the issue of abortion and bodily autonomy, but it's happening across the board. That means that if you want to understand what is changing the policies or constraining your access to opportunity, it is at the state level. There is a bit of a stalemate at the congressional level, and so our opportunities for change, for power, for access will happen at the state and local levels. And again, because I live in the South, I'm always thinking about the fact that more than half of the African American population, a fairly sizable number of people of color, live in the South, and that is the place where the state policies are the most constrained, the most restrictive, and unfortunately now the most intentionally damaging. We just saw what happened in Alabama, we saw what happened in Kentucky. Attacks on civil rights, attacks on our human rights are becoming more and more prevalent, and those are happening at the state level.
Mm-hmm. We all know how important voting rights are for you. So I want to take a moment to talk about why voting, especially for Black women, is so important, and just the power of Black women voters.
Absolutely. So I often say, voting is not magic. Voting is medicine. Magic, you do it once, ta-da, things are done. It doesn't work that way. Voting is medicine. There are ills in our society. There are challenges that we face, and we need to take the medicine to ameliorate the consequences to make us better. But sometimes the medicine is bitter. Sometimes it feels worse than the actual malady that you face. But part of taking medicine is that you've got to do it over and over and over again, because when you stop, often whatever you're facing will metastasize and get worse. And so we have to consistently engage in voting, because voting in and of itself is not the point. It's not about who's on the ballot. It's about who's in the booth. It's about which people are making the choices and how do our lives improve. Because we live in a democracy, because we live in a nation where we elect people to make choices on our behalf, we can't hope that they'll do the right thing once we put them in office. That's like giving someone, putting someone in charge of your store, giving them the keys to the cash register and saying, I'm going to leave for 4 years. Please don't steal anything. And please don't give your friends free stuff. Don't take anything. And I'll be back in 4 years to check on you, but I won't look at anything you've done. I'm just going to make sure that if the store hasn't burned down, I'm going to let you stay. We wouldn't do that in any other place but our politics. And so for me, voting is about how we not only have accountability, but it's also how we demand access to our rights and our responsibilities. When we treat voting as an activity, then it's something it's one and done. I think of it as an action. It is something you do over and over again. And the more we do it, the better we get at it, the better we see the outcomes for the lives we want to lead.
When we think about voter suppression, which we know is a huge top of mind issue for folks at the federal level, like our Congressional Black Caucus, to those at our state and local levels, we know that there's a huge push for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to be passed. We know that voter suppression disproportionately affects Black voters. So a little bit of a controversial question, but are Black voters dangerous?
The question presumes that the outcomes don't benefit everyone. When Black people vote, when we have seen engagement and opportunity, we have seen progress for everyone. Think about Reconstruction. That was a time of economic surplus for a nation coming out of a war when we finally allowed African Americans to fully participate, even for a brief moment. We saw dramatic changes. We saw incredible improvements. We have seen that the locus of power often shifts away from those who can demand the most access and the widest aperture for others. And so to the extent that your intention is to restrict and deny, then the answer could be that this is not a group that you want. But if your goal is actually improving the lives of everyone, then Black participation in voting is absolutely essential. I remind people that we have to remember our votes aren't just our voice, they are an instrument of power. And voter suppression happens in subtle and obvious ways. In the prior to the Voting Rights Act, it was very obvious. Now it's become much more subtle, although they're revealing themselves more often. But voter suppression is, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot? And does that ballot get counted? And so anytime you see any new legislation around voting, any new regulatory schemes, ask yourself, are they restricting your right to register or stay on the rolls? Are they creating any barriers to your ability to cast a ballot? Are they guaranteeing or undermining the ability for your ballot to get counted? That's voter suppression. It is no longer counting beans in a jar. It's shutting down polling places, restricting who can vote by mail. It is making decisions that limit your ability to be heard. And the reason they want you to be silent is because what you say is incredibly powerful. When we show up, we show a difference, and that's why our voices are so important.
I want to pivot very briefly because when you were a student at Spelman, you had gone to the Board of Trustees over tuition hikes. And I don't know if you remember talking about this experience, but you said when you were reflecting on it that we have to stop waiting for people to ask for our opinion. Can you just talk a little bit about why that idea of waiting for somebody to ask us what we think is so important, especially when it comes to Black women?
So as a student at Spelman, I was on scholarship. I availed myself of all financial aid. And I found out tuition was going up, but they weren't increasing my scholarship. I wasn't going to be able to access a higher Pell Grant that year. And somebody was going to have to come up with the money, and I didn't have it. And so the instinct for a lot of my colleagues in college, it was simply to grin and bear it. But for me, it was an existential crisis. My education was on the line. And I'd grown up in a family where my parents taught us, we had 3 jobs: go to church, go to school, and take care of each other. But what underlined all of that was your obligation to speak up, that you could not hope that someone would speak for you. Telepathy doesn't work. I've been practicing for 50 years. It has not happened yet. And so if you don't speak up and demand what you need, if you don't speak up, especially for those who don't know they have the right to be heard, things don't change. And so for me, the conversation about democracy, about voting rights, about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are all about how do we make certain that we are heard. If we wait to be invited to take our power, I promise the invitation is not in the mail. But if we demand our place, if we seize our opportunities, or in my case, and I think for so many, if we create our own opportunities, that's how we start to generate the change that we need to see.
When I think about where we are right now, as I'm sure all of us are intimately aware of, is that we've never had a Black female governor in this country. We've had only 3 Black governors ever, all of them male, the most recent one being Governor Wes Moore being elected. But at the same time, I think about the strides that we as Black women have made when we think about Vice President Kamala Harris, when we think about Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Where is our line? Where do we have to say we still want more? Do we get to keep wanting more for those who are like, well, you're in the White House, you're in the Supreme Court, what more do you need?
We need as much as we can hold. That's our cri de coeur. That's what we should be demanding. Our place in this society should be equal to anyone else's. The reason I'm so passionate about democracy, but also why I'm so proud of the work I was able to do as a candidate, was that me standing for office was not just about getting a job. It would have been lovely to have the job. But it was also about who could see themselves also asking for that power, who could see themselves also demanding the right to move into a position, to demand that promotion, to simply get the respect they are entitled to. I want to see more of us because we should see that we are more than the least common denominator. And too often we are relegated to the worst stereotype, or even worse, we are ignored. Our engagement in this society, our responsibility as Black women in politics, is to make politics work for everyone. And those who have faced the worst examples of bad politics are the ones who are best prepared to make it the most effective means of advancement and improvement. Ultimately, we are all in search of the American dream, and we can define that dream as we see fit. But we can't get there if we don't remove the barriers. And there is no one better to remove the barriers than the person who ran into it. And so for me, Black women in politics is about how we lift this entire nation. And so no, I don't think we've gotten, I am proud of every single person you named, but I know that the fact that you can name them is the problem. We should be legion, and we should be so plentiful and so powerful that we are simply accepted as the right thing to do.
When I think about some of the conversations that are happening right now, particularly I'm thinking of Nicole Hannah-Jones in her recent essay in the New York Times about color blindness being a trap. And if you haven't read the essay, I highly recommend it. But with that in mind, when we're looking at, as you mentioned, I can name these women, right? And that in and of itself is vaguely problematic that we can count them off on our two hands. Will there come a day, or should there come a day, where we're able to say your gender, your race doesn't matter to be able to represent? Or do we want to keep that in mind in order to say, but I know those barriers and what we had to overcome?
A few years ago, I wrote an essay for the Council for Foreign Affairs on identity politics. Identity politics is perfectly acceptable unless they don't like your identity. And when we hear about class, when we hear about women, when we hear about business, those are all identities. Why are our identities any less relevant? Representation matters because representation is the avatar for understanding what preceded that moment. If you don't understand what's wrong, you cannot make it right. Therefore, representation is absolutely important. And there should never be a moment where representation is diminished. The question is, how much power should it have because there's so much difference in what you get? So our issue should not be the fact that people cling to identity. It's the fact that we allow identity to distinguish your access to power. That's why the fight over DEI is so important. Right now, there is this very reductive narrative that DEI is this recent phenomenon on college campuses that has to be stamped out. DEI describes every single movement we have had since the Revolutionary War. Any opportunity to move this country forward, Reconstruction, suffrage, the Chicano movement, the disability movement, the LGBTQIA movement, the labor movement, those are all diversity, equity, and inclusion movements that exist because that's how we make our country better. Our representation matters because it's the way we get to the American dream that we've all been told we are entitled to. So either we change the ethos of this nation or we change the process that makes it so. And my intention is to change the process. That's why I work so hard to make certain we can all vote, that we can participate, and irrespective of who we vote for, you should have the right to be heard. But representation in that is absolutely essential because you cannot solve problems you don't acknowledge. And more importantly, you won't solve the next problem if you don't have the experience of having solved one before.
We have a few more minutes, but I do want to offer our students, our audience, a moment if anybody would like to ask a question. We have a microphone right over here.
Hello, my name is Camila Armas. I'm a freshman political science major from Howard University. And my question is that there was a lot of hope for the Biden administration and the Congress coming into 2020 in terms of making positive policy change. And a lot of people are disappointed in the seeming lack of results. So where does policy change that will most affect the issues Black women and other minorities face happen? On a local and state level, or is there still hope for the national level coming into 2024? Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. So I would say that we have seen dramatic improvements because I want us to remember what 2020 was like. I know a lot of us want to forget, but 2020 was hard. And since that time, we have seen dramatic action, not only on climate change, on attempts to make sure we expand job opportunities, on health care. We had a child tax credit that got taken away. So what we've got to remember is what was and then what disappeared. There were moments that were instituted by the Biden administration and by that Congress that when the congressional makeup changed, those changes disappeared. And so we cannot eschew federal engagement, and we should always hold to the reality that even though we get what we want, the other side gets what they want too. And so it's a constant tension, and our obligation is to make sure we're a little bit further ahead than the other guys. So my very strong sentiment is that we have had a successful administration that can't get everything done because there's a lot to do, which is why they're asking for 4 more years. But putting that aside, what we also cannot do is think that every problem gets solved at the federal level. That is why my focus is so assiduously on state politics, because we know that for most Americans, the choices about education, about the economy, and about elections is not federal. It's actually state. It's either because of a stalemate at the federal level or because they've already devolved that power to the state and local governments. And so we've got to have a both-and approach, both state and local and federal. But when we decide to focus on one to the exclusion of the other, the people who are fighting against our advancement are going to take the power of that other space and use it against us. So we've got to look everywhere all the time.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hi.
I see you too, so go ahead and stand behind her because you keep popping up and down.
Hi, my name is Taylin Sharp. I'm a student at Georgetown University, and I'm also with Codex. I have a question. You focus heavily on grassroots and local politics. Can you expand on some of the obstacles that Black women find in running for local politics, and can you expand on the importance of Black women in these roles? Thank you.
Absolutely. Black women have to be represented at every level of politics because we live at every level of lives. We don't simply exist in the federal ether. We do not simply exist in the federal ether, and therefore we have to pay attention to what's happening to our children or to ourselves in an educational setting. That's local politics. We have to understand what's happening with bodily autonomy. That's state politics. We have to know who gets access to funding for capital, for our jobs, and for the businesses we want to start. That's state and local and federal. We've got to pay attention to the constraints on our ability to grow our opportunities. That happens at all levels. And so I start at the grassroots because when you can create the strongest team, those teams then send up your players. I mean, it's kind of like a farm team. Sorry, I use a lot of sports analogies. But if you only have one person at the local level, that person may not make it all the way up. That's why you need as many as possible starting at the most easily accessible level, but it's only easily accessible if there are resources. It's hard for Black women to raise money, in part because it's hard for Black women to ask for money. It's hard to make it through the political systems that give you the right to know that you can ask for money. I operate in a space where I just don't ask for permission. And sometimes I ask for forgiveness, but even that sometimes. Part of it is that we've got to own our authority to do what needs to be done without needing other people to say it's the right thing to do. And so we should run for office when there's an office open, but we should also help our friends run for those offices. And we have to lower our barriers to entry where we expect you to be perfect before you start. If they can learn on the job, so can we. And we can learn at each level of the job. And it's not just about who's holding the office. It's who's the chief of staff, who's making the phone calls, who's writing the press releases. Because the way we tell our stories often determine how our stories are heard. And so we've got to build not just the candidates for local office. My grassroots work has focused not only on who's running, but who's running the campaign, who's running the staff, and who's running their mouth when you are not in the room. And if you think about all of those places, that's how we grow our capacity to run for everything and one day run everything.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Gabrielle Draper. I'm a senior psychology and political science student at Howard. And my question kind of revolves around the mental health aspect. I read recently in a book by Congressman Raskin that if you don't have constituents who are well, you're not going to have constituents who are voting. And so I'm curious as to how, you know, in your work to promote more engagement in voting on the state level, really at every level, but how can we address the mental health aspect and really give people just the self-autonomy to actually get to the polls themselves and really know that their vote matters?
So I think there are two component pieces to that, and I appreciate the question. One is a structural issue. Again, I reference the South a lot because it is emblematic of so many of the broken pieces that we have in our infrastructure. The absence of Medicaid expansion in southern states means that millions of people are denied access to mental health care, because embedded in the Affordable Care Act and therefore in Medicaid expansion is access to that mental health support. Coming out of COVID, out of the pandemic, there was never a more acute moment than the proof that we needed holistic health care. And yet an entire region of the country is continuing to deny access. And so we've got to demand that our governments actually provide access. I live in a state, the state of Georgia, that is willing to spend $26 million to provide access to 3,000 people, 3,500, let me give them credit, as opposed to accepting billions of dollars to serve more than 500,000 people. It is a decision that is a disgrace, and the mental health component is absolutely a key reason that we have to make certain that healthcare is expanded across this country to everyone. And then there's just the daily trauma of living. And part of what I tell folks, when you're trying to engage voters, lectures don't work. No one has ever been lectured into action. You just do it because you're tired of hearing it. But the lecture itself is not what creates the change. But our job is not to lecture. Our job is to ask, how can I help? What is hurting you? What do you need? If you want to convert someone from non-voting to voting, or if you want to change their vote from one side to the other, ask them what they need and then listen to their answers and help them find solutions. My teams, whenever I run for office and whenever I'm in office, their job is to say, how can I help first and foremost? Because if you start with that, you create a sense of empathy, but also you create an action-oriented behavior. I can help you, but I need you to help yourself by showing up to make certain that I'm in a position of power to make that help real.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to give a big thank you to you for joining us today. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is Stacey Abrams, Ronald W. Walters Endowed Chair of Race and Black Politics at Howard University. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. No, it's okay. I'm used to us.
Back then it was because I watched a lot of Amy biographies. There was Elizabeth Montgomery. I used her last name, and then her evil twin on Bewitched, Serena.
Cool.
Yep.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Hi.
Yes.
I would now like to welcome our next guest, Whitley Yates, Director of Diversity and Engagement for the Indiana Republican Party. Whitley, thank you so much for being here, looking stunning. I'm loving this outfit.
The fashion is foundational.
So we have been talking today all about Black women in politics, and right now you served as the Director of Diversity and Engagement for the Indiana Republican Party for, is it 4 years now?
I'm still there.
Still there, 4 years. And I just want to touch a little bit on the power of Black Republican women, because we often, I know, hear that Black Americans are very loyal to the Democrats, but we know Black voters are not a monolith. And as you were here showcasing to us, as well as Roxy earlier and Kimberly earlier, is that not every Black person out there is a Democrat. So what is the power of Black female Republicans?
That's such a heavy question. And it's heavy because there has been a void of Black women engaging and interacting within the Republican Party. And I think that part of it is by design. And I think the other part is the designation of the voices that were uplifted were not voices that connected to community. So if I can't see myself in what you're saying and how you're behaving, then you cannot advocate for me in a way that is beneficial. Coming into my role, being the only Director of Diversity in any Republican Party in the country, in a time where DEI is frowned upon within the Republican Party, was a feat in and of itself. To layer the intersectionality of being first on top of first in a party that doesn't have many on top stages, in top positions that look like me, layered with my race, and then we'll put the cherry on top of my gender. It makes for a very unique situation because the barriers that exist for all are now heightened because of all of these intersectionalities. So my intentionality in sitting in this role and understanding that the level of publicity, good or bad, the level of vitriol and hate that is going to come towards me, it's going to take a lot for me to continue to swim upstream. When I see people and I hear the conversations being had, when I look at the level of representation of the Roxys, it gives me hope, it gives me fuel to consistently show up in the way that I need to do my job. Because the truth is that when you look at other Black Republican women that have been given a microphone, a lot of them are not representative of a majority of what Black women feel and what we're experiencing. And so I think it's vitally important for Black Republican women to understand how important their voice is so that they can utilize that in the space that they sit in, knowing that they may be the only one there.
You mentioned all of these intersecting identities that you have in this position, and just hearing you talk about it, it just sounds very daunting to be in this role. I think anytime being the first of anything, it has a little bit of that anxiety. But looking out at our audience right now, you know, how would you just walk somebody through being the first Black woman, first anything, and to say you can continue doing that. It might be scary, but keep pushing forward.
So, you know, I'm a very purpose-driven person. So coming into this role, I was like, I don't know if that's for me. I like to be unbought and unbothered. I don't want to put any titles. I don't want to be affiliated or assimilated, but I understood that I needed to be on this side. I understood that I needed to be at these tables because the leaders who were making the choices and decisions hadn't been exposed to the things that I had been exposed to. So I understood that the policies being predicated at the tables that I didn't sit at were going to be as narrow as the people that were sitting at the table. So in order for me to continue to push forward and understand that, I have to create a series where other people feel included in places and spaces where we haven't felt before. So I not only have to walk through these doors and blaze these trails for myself, but I have to blaze them for the people that I'm bringing up with me to help them get elected and to help them be civically engaged. So my stamina, I really draw it from understanding my purpose and my place. So when I'm met with adversity, I don't question it because I understand that I'm supposed to be met with adversity. Because just the sheer fact that I'm in this role and in this position, that I walk into rooms and my presence in the rooms create and shake tables without me even speaking. So I'm aware that there is a power in my presence before I profess what is in my head, and how that it really just shifts the power structures, it shifts the conversations, it shifts the perspectives. And so I run a leadership series to get underrepresented minorities engaged and involved in the Republican Party. I've been doing it now for 4 years in Indiana, and it's the only one of its kind on the Republican side in all 50 states. I sit here as someone who cultivated that out of wanting to see what we didn't already have, and to allow people to know not only that we're not monolithic, but that we can be the types of leaders that you're proud of. That we're not symbols of leadership, but we're substantive in our positions. That we're not selling out our community to assimilate to a majority culture, which you see a lot of, specifically on the right. And so in cultivating this series, in finding people who understood that if politics is a game of chess and you have to protect the king is not a person, it's not yourself, it is the community in which you come from and that you represent. So how you're showing up for that community and how you move the pieces, even the ones that aren't on your side, how you engage and interact and create strategies of success is all for one goal, and it is to protect and to elevate that community. And so I sit here on this stage after running this series and people telling me on both sides that I wasn't going to be successful, that nobody wants to not only identify as conservative or Republican, but they definitely don't want to be affiliated or run for office. I sit here as someone that has a successful nationally lauded program where we have been able to elect the first Black Republican president in the history of Indiana. And it's because I understood the mission and I didn't let the barriers be a distraction. And I think someone said it before, but the best person to obliterate the barrier is the person who met it. And so as I'm forging the way for those behind me and able to also sit here and say that we got the first Black woman elected in the history of Fishers on the council. She's actually the first Black person ever elected in the history of Fishers in Hamilton County, one of the most wealthiest counties in Indiana. It is because I understood my assignment, I stayed focused on my purpose, and I also brought other people with me to continue the work.
You said something that really struck me, which was that the idea of for Black Republican, you're selling out to your community, and that is something that we hear often. Do you think that we are focusing too much on Black voters or Black leaders on where are you identifying right now, and before we're able to decide if we can trust you? Like, do you think we do that with other leaders, or do we just doing it with Black folks, and especially with Black women?
Now, Cheyanne. Ooh, so
I'm putting her on the spot, y'all.
So I'm going to be honest. Yes, it is heavier on the right. And the reason why it's heavier on the right is because the mistrust we talked about earlier. It's because the lack of seeing people that look like yourself on that side. More importantly, that compounded with the rhetoric that also feels against you. It feels abrasive. It feels like sandpaper. So there is a heavier burden to be. And I say that to say that a lot of Black women Republicans actually have to prepare to come out and tell people how they feel, because we don't necessarily have the luxury of being independent in our political ideology. We actually have to prepare to explain why we think and why we feel and why we align, because we don't necessarily have the freedom to go against what is popular and common. And to say that on the other side, there isn't that, they don't have that level to where they have to prove who they are. I would say that on one side, I can see a lot of people who look like me, and I don't necessarily see our communities getting better. On the other side, I can say that there may not be a lot of people who look like me, and I can't necessarily see our communities getting better. And so I think the question is not about whether or not we should be looking for representation through our race and through our gender, but it is the resonance and not symbols of leadership, but substantive leaders that create policies that progress our communities. And so if I have someone that looks like me that's not progressing my community, how is that representative of me? On the flip side, if I don't have anyone that looks like me and my community's not being progressed, then I know that I'm not represented. And so it's almost a double entendre. I think that there should be intentionality placed on having diverse voices at the table. And I also believe that there should be strong intentionality placed on having substantive leaders at the table. And that substance comes from how they're able to progress their communities through policies that are impactful.
I think about your series that you mentioned, the Indiana Republican Diversity Leadership Series. Can you talk a little bit more about that series? But also, I'm curious, how do you see the work that you're doing with this series translating to be nationwide?
You know, when I think about the work that I've done in Indiana and the support that I've received, I tell people, like, some of my biggest haters when I began are my biggest supporters now. Some of the people who looked at my face and told me I wouldn't be successful have given me thousands of dollars to support the success that we've had. And so I'm very thankful for the journey that I'm on. As I sit here today, there's a woman who's running for Congress in this audience who reached out to me through LinkedIn. And it is important for me to understand that the work that I'm doing is not siloed to a state. That the representation that we're creating does not reside within the walls of Indiana. That having Roxy come and speak, and she was our keynote speaker for our graduation, so that our participants can see leadership in action, is so important. I've spoken with 4 other states that are interested in carrying on this work, and it is my hope that I am able to have seeds in multiple states so that we have representation on all sides. And that you know that when I walk in that room and when I sit at that table, that I'm not gonna say something that's gonna be negative against our community. That you can trust that I'm community-centered, and when presented, in politics this happens, when presented with opportunities to propel self or community, that I choose community every time. In the face of what may look appealing or may be appetizing for my own personal worth, for my own personal gain, that I understand that it's a larger picture. And I think sometimes, specifically with Black people, we're just so glad to get an opportunity to get in the room. Like, I'm just glad I got in the room. I'm just glad I got my foot in the door. Not understanding that you were positioned for a time such as this, not just to be in the room, but to use your voice and to advocate at those tables. To say, that's not right. Absolutely not. We haven't eradicated abject poverty in this nation or in this state. Or to say, absolutely not. I'm a Black woman and I'm afraid to bear a child in this country because that maternal mortality rate is so low. To say that I'm not listened to by doctors and I'm not believed. Like, there is a unique perspective that you bring. So don't just be happy to be in the room. Utilize your voice to create the change necessary. And so, you know, I would love to have those seeds and plant those seeds everywhere. I would love to continue to increase civic engagement and involvement, specifically within the Republican side, because we have so much work to do. And I believe that this is a unique time where if we stay focused on policy and how policy impacts people, then we will progress not only our states, but this country.
Mm-hmm. And Whitley, I have one last quick question for you, but maybe the hardest question. As we heard one of our student audience members say earlier, is that we are in such a polarizing political time right now. I think that we would all be lying to ourselves if we said that we weren't. With that in mind, what keeps you going as you're doing this work?
In a polarizing time that we are in, what keeps it, you know, that's interesting. So I look at national politics and everything that's happening. I mean, it's not even just politics now, it's the culture, right? Politics is downstream from the culture. The culture is polarizing. Like, I'm on Black Twitter each and every day because I live there. And I'm watching, like, there's, you know, American-born Black people versus Black immigrants. There is women versus men. There has been an increase in the polarization of people and almost tribalism in engaging. When I see it in the political sphere, I think that we have become reminiscent of what drives and fuels our society. So our society now commodifies attention, right? Attention is the new commodity, and we're exchanging in it daily. It is a currency that we hadn't seen before, and Gen Z, you know, has never been without it. And so with all of that happening, our politics have become entertaining, a performance, if you will, where you have people who are insiders supposed to be producing policy, pretending and performing about what's happening and what's going wrong, but you are elected in this position to fix and change the things that you're telling us is wrong. So you have a lot of performative leadership. And so as I'm watching all of this, people want to be entertained. They want someone to love, they want someone to hate, they want someone to root for. And so it's really easy to get swept and caught up in the story of the day. Who said what, who's doing all of these things. And I look at them, honestly, specifically like federal politics, as like the sun. It's on all the news stations, it's on all the news cycles. You can see it, you go outside, you can feel the sun on you, although I cannot feel it today, but I'm hopeful DC will show me better weather. But a lot of times it's focusing on the politics in your hometown. It's that local level, that state level, that governor, who is your Secretary of State. And those politics and looking at how you engage on that level, that's like gravity. Is your trash getting picked up? Are your street lights on? What do your neighborhoods look like? How much blight is happening? And so we have a tendency as a nation and a society to focus on the sun. And a lot of times we don't necessarily remember gravity. And so I want to implore all of the young people watching, do not be distracted with the tribalism and the polarization. There are going to be political personalities that pop up. You're going to love some, you're going to hate some, you're going to root for others. Understand that it is the policies predicated that will live on. As politics is a pendulum of power that swings back and forth in both directions. But these policies that they create, these laws that they sign, live on forever. From 1865, when we were freed, and beyond. Those laws are still on the books. So whether or not the person that put them in place is still in power, that personality is long gone and not here, but understanding that what they penned still has purpose today. We've got to focus our priorities on the policies predicated and not be caught up in the performance of political personalities, because it's not necessarily politically profitable for us as a people and as a society to get caught up in those personalities.
Absolutely. I want to give a huge thank you to Whitley Yates for being here today, for flying from Indiana to come talk with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys.
Come here, I didn't even
I
get to say hi
know.
to you today.
And I brought my daughter so she can see Black women leading.
Oh, yay! Joining us now as our final guest is Congresswoman Cori Bush, co-chair of the Equal Rights Amendment Caucus and Congressional Black Caucus member. Thank you so much for joining us, Congresswoman. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad to be here with you all.
Absolutely. So we have been talking today about Black women in politics, the power of Black women, the power of Black women voters. And I just want to take a moment because last March, you and I believe Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley really took the lead in showing the power and strength of Black women when you revitalized the introduction of the Equal Rights Amendment. Can you talk to me just a little bit about not only what the ERA would do for Black women, but why it's Black women leading the charge to have this amendment passed?
Absolutely. And thank you, Cheyanne. So it took me a long time to even realize that the ERA was something that we needed to speak on in this day. I think I kind of felt like this was something for white women to champion. White women had all, that's who you heard talk more about it. But it wasn't until one day when I realized that so many of the things that we are working on and Black women are fighting for, or where so many of the disparities lie, are all like under this umbrella of what the ERA would do. The Equal Rights Amendment, which is over 100 years old, it turned 100 years old since its drafting on my birthday last year, July 21st. So we're at almost 101 years, and gender equality is still not enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. And so for us, for Black women, Rep. Pressley and I just decided that it needed a home, first of all. It needed a home, and this is the first time in the history of the ERA that Black women carried this legislation. First time, 100 years. And so we decided, give it a home so that we can talk about the issues and we can rally our members of Congress. So whether it's violence against women, housing discrimination, the gender wage gap, the racial wage gap, abortion access and rights, so the reproductive freedom, reproductive justice, trans rights, LGBTQ rights, so much of it is housed. Healthcare equality is housed under the Equal Rights Amendment. And for us, if we can get the Equal Rights Amendment done, first of all, the word women goes into the U.S. Constitution, but then also it will be, the Equal Rights Amendment will be an anchor. It will be an anchor to pass better laws or to improve the enforcement of laws that are already on the books. And so that's what we need. We need this country to recognize that we don't just have it because we exist. We don't just have our rights and our freedoms because we breathe. That's not what's happening. As we can see, our rights are being stripped away from us, and so we want our country to affirm them.
When I think about all of the many women's rights movements that this country has had, and I know sociologists will say we're in like fourth wave feminism at this point, I believe, and I think about when we learn about it and the many women who were involved, but the way that many of us who in this room would have been relegated to the back of those movements,
Yes.
even as we were helping propel them forward.
Yes.
So I want to take a minute to ask you, what is it about the strength and the power and dedication of Black women that keeps us saying, we're still going to keep pushing forward?
Yes, thank you for that question. So, Pauli Murray, the great Pauli Murray, I believe, said it best, and I'm going to paraphrase her. She said that Black women have the most to gain from the adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment. Black women are doubly victimized by the twin immoralities of racial and sexual bias. And so because of that, we understand that because we have the most to gain, we have to be the ones. We can't wait for anyone else to speak up to us or to speak to our situation and our challenges the way that we can. We have to speak up for ourselves. Now, it's great when other people will advocate with us, will work with us and be those co-conspirators with us, but we have to make it clear what's happening to us. And I think that that's something that if we're walking through living a life where we're told we should, why aren't Black women doing this thing this way? Why aren't, but in order to get there, Black women carry the most student debt than anyone else in the country. Women carry the most student debt, but Black women carry it the most and the longest. So that's an issue. But we also only make anywhere from 63, 64 cents on the dollar that our white counterpart makes. So then that helps to push us back even more. So we have barrier after barrier. And so for Black women to speak up and say, this is what's happening to us, but we're also going to be the ones to champion moving forward, how we move forward, it's critical because our voice matters. And so to be the ones, like you said, relegated to the back, when you see those videos, that archival footage of Black women being in the back, all the suffragette movement and, all these women, these white women in white, marching, and then you have Black women all the way in the back, and Black women are getting, pummeled with rocks and all of that, just trying to be a part of a movement to say that I should have the right to vote, to say that I should have, autonomy, the autonomy of my own body. We didn't stop there because we understand what happens next. And so it's the legacy. When we think about prior to 1973, when the Dobbs decision, the right to abortion happened. I'm sorry, Roe v. Wade, not Dobbs. When Roe v. Wade was enacted, Black women, the leading cause of death for Black women was documented as sepsis that would come from unsafe abortions.
I want to get a little bit personal because I think about that legacy that you're talking about and the way that so many Black women of intergenerationally have been driving the nation forward and toward progress. And obviously today we have seen just so many Black women on this stage. But I think we would all be lying if we didn't acknowledge that there's a lot of hate and vitriol that comes with us being in these positions. And I speak from experience as a race and politics reporter, and I know this is something you are familiar with as well, is the hate mail, the calls, the emails, all of that. How would you look into this crowd and look to our audience who are watching and say, in spite of that, or despite that, we still need you. We still want you to be part of this.
Absolutely. Because what they want is to silence us. They want to shut us down. They want to keep the status quo. And so they use these tactics. These are old tactics. There's nothing new under the sun in this situation. But it is effective. They understand that. And so if they can keep, if the critiques and the attacks, if the torment, the bullying, the intimidation, the harassment, if all of that can just keep going every single day, it's been so bad to where I even had to evacuate my office for a week. I had to close down my office in St. Louis and have my staff home because of the hate, because of the threats. So, and we're not talking about just some folks, some trolls on social media. We're talking about people that actually feel like it's their duty to take out Cori Bush, and for me, taking out Cori Bush, if you miss and you hit my staff, so I have a problem with that. So it's not just about me, but for those of us that have made the decision, you know what? It's about the legacy. It's about what comes next. And so I'm less afraid of what you can do to me I'm more afraid of what happens if we don't get the change that we seek. That is what my issue is. So I'm not afraid of, because let me tell you, bullets have already come my way. Bullets have come my way. Bullets have hit my vehicle multiple times, even with my child in the car. I have been through attempts on my life multiple times. But I know that if they could shut me up, if they could shut up other people like me, then that's how they win. And so they're frustrated that they can't. And so we need more people, the more of us that stand together, you know, and say that we won't allow these attacks, this violence that they're trying to throw our way to stop us. You know, the same way that folks crossed that bridge and the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma and said, you know, even though we see what's on the other side, I'm going to go anyway because this is what we need. This is about the legacy. This is about what comes next. In the same way, we will stand. So in the face of all the adversity, and this is not just fake stuff for television, for likes or anything like that. This is real life, what we actually face, what so many Black women in politics face. And just Black women in community, in organizing and in different parts of this movement. You all, we need you. We need you, but part of that need is to know who you are and what you stand for. Every day I wake up in the morning, I know who I am. I know what I stand for, and I know if they take me out today, that I stood 10 toes down for my community and for my people, and that they can never take from me.
Y'all hear this passion? Can we just take a moment? You know, every time I'm at a press conference with you, and they're always like, oh man, we got to follow that up, or we got preacher Cori Bush in the house. That's what they always say. And I think we can hear that organizer background of yours really shining through. And before I turn it over to see if any of our audience members might want to ask a question, I do want to ask you how much of that organizer personality, character, drive plays into the legislation that you bring forward to the House floor every day?
Every bit, every bit. When I enter Congress, I coined the term politivist. I said that I'm going in as the politician and the activist. And I'm a politician just because of the definition of the word, you know, it's the actual definition. But I'm a politician and an activist because I said that I would not let go of my movement background, my organizers and activists, my protester family that I work with, Ferguson Frontline, you know, I won't let go of them, but all the other areas where I organize, we are all coming to the table together. So when we craft legislation, that's how we craft our legislation. We work with those groups. We ask for advice. We ask for counsel, and we work together to draft legislation because the motto of my office is to do the absolute most for every single person in our district, starting with those who have the greatest need. So that's how we do that.
Absolutely. So we don't have a microphone for questions, but if somebody would like to speak loudly, I would like to offer you a moment to ask the Congresswoman a question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Amber Dodd.
You can stand up, yeah.
Hi, I'm Amber Dodd. I'm the Howard Magazine Associate Editor. And I just really resonate with what you just said about, you know, putting people who have those needs first. How do you strategize centering the most disadvantaged men?
So the question is basically, how do I strategize to center the people who have the greatest need? Is that correct? First of all, because I was one of those people. So that's how I look at it. I think about where I was and what I needed and how people crafting legislation thought that they were doing such a good job. But because they had never been through those struggles, they didn't know what they were stepping over. And so I've been unhoused. I lived in the car with my 2 children for a number of months and my partner at the time. And we would just park in front of someone's home and just hope that the police didn't stop us, you know, because we had this strange cars in front of someone's house all night. And I couldn't go to sleep really because I was worried that my 2 babies in the back, like if it would get too cold at night, if one of them I would wake up and if one of them would be dead. So I was mixing formula in the bathroom at a local McDonald's. And so I've worked as a low-wage worker, uninsured. I entered Congress as an uninsured person. I have almost lost my life to domestic violence on multiple counts. The person left me for dead. So I have been through so many of the things that people in our communities have gone through. I have asthma right now partly because of the environment in which I live. So over and over again, I am the people that I serve, you know, and so that's how I'm able to do it. I look at what it was like to be unhoused, what it was like to be sexually assaulted, what it was like to be, you know, to suffer domestic violence, and just so many other things. And how do I craft legislation to be able to speak to those things that you go through? And for one quick example, when I decided to do a protest on the Capitol steps, some of you may have seen it, because they were the eviction moratorium was about to expire, and 11 million people were going to be at risk for evictions. And I'm like, how do we, as Congress, just go on vacation, go home, and like let that happen? And so I didn't know what else to do. I said, well, let me just do a protest on the steps. But one thing that was brought to me was people were like, oh, well, they can just go to food pantries and get food. They can do this and that. And I was like, do you not realize that in some places, food pantries you can go to once a month? You know, so how do you get food for the rest of the month if you can only go once a month? And they're going to give me milk. Where am I putting milk if I'm living in my car? Like, it was those types of things. And people were like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. So.
I think we have time for one more. Again, you might have to speak a little loud.
Oh. Just speak in here. Okay. Hi, my name is Courtney McLean. I've been an activist in South Carolina for the past 4 years, and I definitely resonate with how all of the violence, especially being in the Deep South. So my question is, how do we create more confidence and getting people to come out and come to these protests, do grassroots organizing, and just making sure that people feel comfortable, even though we do know the risks that come with activism?
And so I think part of it too is finding out what people's thing, because not everybody is on the ground, you know, show up to the protest activists. Some people are more for, you know, using their microphone, you know, for in journalism. Some people are, you know, the ones that need to be in the courtroom, you know, with their activism, or the boardroom. So figuring out what that is. Or some people are the activists with the check, because the check matters. But then you have the folks, it does matter, because we got to eat when you're on that front line, you know, and all of that. But the folks that do feel like I can be on the ground, it's about making that connection. Why we need you in particular on the ground, what you bring to this front line. That's the part that I think sometimes that we miss. People feel like, well, somebody else will do it, or I may lose my job. I may lose my friends. Which are all very true, because that happened to us during the Ferguson uprising. But it's about helping them to see that you bring something to this movement. You, exactly who you are, what I tell people is, when I was running for office, I would say, I don't care if your thing is tying shoes well, because at some point while I'm out here knocking these doors, my shoes may come untied, and so everything, I don't care if you collect stamps, like something is your thing. So letting people know that something is your thing, and you can bring that to this movement on the ground, make the signs, you know, whatever it is. So I think that's part of it, but them knowing why how this affects their kitchen, how this affects their bathroom, how this affects them when they go to the doctor and they hop up on that exam table. It's about making that connection, making it really life applicable.
I want to give a very heartfelt thank you to Congresswoman Cori Bush for joining us today. Thank you so much. We always appreciate you.
Thank you all.
And sadly, that is the conclusion of our show. So I will turn it over to wonderful Sarah.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bush, and thank you, Cheyanne. That brings us to the end of the program. Thank you very much to our partners and hosts, Howard University, and everyone who joined us in person and online today. If you missed any portion of today's program, it is available on thehill.com, and it will also be available on WHUT starting in early April. Thank you all for joining us today.